I washed around in a pool of snotty-nosed brats when I was a kid. It was fun. You always had somebody to dig a hole with, or throw rocks, ride bikes, or play catch. We hung out because we lived on the same block. There was never any reaching out. All of us were just there. That comfortable reality changed sometime in my 13th year. It was called adolescence. Suddenly, I was on one side of the room, and the objects of my desire were on the other. There was nothing but games and one-upmanship in between. My target would be in a herd of giggling girls, and I would have to go over and lay it on the line. I wasn't bad-looking. I normally got what I wanted. But once in a while, a little bitch would decide to score points with her gaggle. The walk back to the dugout after that strikeout was excruciating, especially if I heard tittering behind me. Some of my pals would step right back up to the plate, but most of us weren't that secure. Rejection wounded our manly pride. So, we'd sit in a pack and sulk. If it was a trade-off between feeling shitty because we might get shot down versus feeling shitty because the only sex you got was from your hand, the hand always won. A guy's ego is fragile at that age. School is full of apex predators. You know the type, big, rich macho men, whose worldview is confined to building up their alpha male cred. Average guys like us couldn't compete, and we all knew it. Women have status issues too, but no female above the age of consent has to worry about getting dick. It's basic biology. All they have to do is say, yes. The bubbling hormones take over from there. In general, I was a together guy. I did well in college, and I was a scholarship lacrosse athlete. But I never pushed things past the point where the girl said, no. I'll admit that was an anomaly in guyland, since most of my friends thought that no wasn't a declarative statement. The rest thought that no actually meant yes. Regrettably, at least for my horniness problem, my parents insisted that I respect women. So, I took no at face value. Of course, all my friends called me a chicken, and not surprisingly, my over-civilized approach to sex limited my carnal romps to a few frantic fumbles with low-hanging fruit. Even those didn't happen very often. Since that type of girl had her own fan club, I eventually accepted the fact that none of the women my age would recognize my true awesomeness. So, I did what any sensible fellow would do. I went fishing in younger waters. That's where I found Karen. Or more accurately, that was where she found me. I was walking between buildings when a sweet voice said, "Do you know where Reno Hall is?" I looked at the source. She was girl next door, cute, long blonde hair, beautiful round face, 5'2" and 110 pounds of tight little body, hugging a book to her succulent round tits. It happened so fast that I didn't have time to hesitate or say something stupid. Instead, I smiled and said, "I'm headed that way. I'll show you." That simple decision changed my life. I'd made the commitment to walk with the girl, so it was natural to converse. In fact, it would have been a little creepy to shuffle along in silence. Hence, I asked my new companion the obvious question, "What's your name?" I discovered that her name was Karen, and she was a freshman. She was 19 years old, and she'd come to the Big U to get a law degree. Karen's parents were lawyers. Thus, there was a lot more interest in the big picture. I'm a nerd. We're interested in Dungeons and Dragons, not humanity in general. Still, Karen was serious about her schooling. I was too. We had the same values, and we cared about the same things. So, we were just naturally simpatico. When we got to our destination, I turned to face my little friend. She was looking at me longingly. I had to take the next step, no matter how much it threatened my delicate macho. I said, with a casualness that I didn't feel, "This has been interesting. Would you like to study together someday?" Her face lit up like she had finally gotten definitive proof that there was a God. She said, "I was hoping you'd ask me. I spend the night at the same table in the library. I'm there. Anytime you want to see me." I was there that night and every other night. It was my first experience with grown-up love. We just bonded. I finally mustered the courage to ask my little pal out on a real date. She gave me a secret smile and said, "Pick me up at 7. It was like she was 5 jumps ahead, which was a little disquieting. Up to that point, I had viewed Karen as being even less experienced than I was. Perhaps she was more mature than I thought. Or maybe girls are just a little smarter. I picked her up at her dorm. She was wearing an adorable short linen dress with a spaghetti strap top. Her round little mounds peeked out of the top, and a superb pair of legs stuck out the bottom. They were attached to a cute bubble butt. Her blonde hair was worn long and shiny, and she was so happy to see me that she was almost prancing with eagerness. I planned a classic college date, meaning I took her to a frat party. I was never into fraternities. That was mainly because no fraternity was into me, but I did have friends who were frat rats. So, I cashed in my chips to try to impress Karen. I ended up impressing my friends. none of whom ever imagined I could find a babe like her. As you might expect, bringing a girl with Karen's looks to a frat party was like dropping a beautiful little woolly lamb into a wolf pack. As soon as I went off to get us a beer, the brothers descended on her in droves. I had to fight my way through 5 guys when I got back. I was holding 2 solo cups full of the good stuff, and it kept sloshing on the floor. Karen looked a bit overwhelmed as she took her beer. We talked to her admirers for a while. Actually, they were only talking to Karen. She, in turn, kept cutting me pleading looks. Of course, I missed the significance of the look, but I missed a lot back then. I just thought she was shy. So, instead of snatching her away from her slavering mob of admirers, I stood there like a geek, watching the sweltering mob dance. That was when Montana Brooks strolled in. He played quarterback, and everybody on campus knew who he was. A guy like Montana thought that frat parties were the candy store, and he was the kid. They were most certainly the happy hunting ground for a stud like him. 6'2", 215 of speed and elusiveness with a cannon for an arm. That isn't to mention the shock of blonde hair, the arrogant wasp face, and the brash attitude. Montana was my worst nightmare, a narcissistic bully, with an overinflated sense of self, unequivocally convinced that he was God's gift to women. He did a gander around the room, spotted Karen, and his eyes locked in on her like an air-to-air missile. She really was the hottest girl at the party. He sauntered over to my date, radiating cool, and said, "Let's dance, babe." Karen looked at him with undisguised interest. He really was a hunka burnin' love. The rest of her admirers just melted away. I would have joined them, but I was rooted to the spot. It was a matter of pride. I knew that I was going to look like a cuck if she disappeared upstairs to screw him, but I also knew that I wasn't going to win a pissing contest if I made a federal case out of him asking her to dance. So, I was trapped. My only hope was that Karen would make the right decision. Brooks was one of those apex predators, and I still had a lot to learn. That night I learned about the role that choice plays in sexual politics. It was also my first real insight into the labyrinth that is the female mind. Strong women like to be pursued, but they don't like to be seen as prey. Men traditionally have the advantage because we are the aggressor. Our role lets us choose the female we want to cut out of the herd. All the woman has to do is let herself be culled, and therein lies the real power, the ability to make that choice. Karen took an appraising look at the arrogant son of a bitch and said in her most gracious voice, "I'm sorry, but I'm with Christian." Brooks reacted like she just told him that the earth was flat. Then it dawned on him that she had actually shot him down. He looked at Karen, radiating contempt, and said, "You're with him now, but you could be with me? What do you say?" That visibly pissed Karen off. She said with steam coming out of her ears, "I'd prefer to be with somebody who saw me as a person, not a conquest." Then she grabbed my arm and said emphatically, "Please take me someplace else." We went to the local campus restaurant. At least I could buy her a burger, if not provide her with the status that Brooks could have. I said curiously, "I thought I'd lost you." Montana always gets what he wants. She looked like she'd bitten into something sour. She said, "I was tonight's sacrifice on the altar of his ego. He didn't care about me. All he wanted to do was screw me." She added, eyes glistening, "We have a genuine, respectful relationship, you and me, and I don't want to lose that. So, I made my choice and it's you." That was another thing I learned that night. Unlike me, this 19-year-old girl already had a well-developed sense of values and a lot of wisdom packed into her delectable little body. I wondered how she got so insightful. The ensuing night was an eye-opener. I prefer distance and objectivity. I guess you might call me intellectual. But intellectual is not the same word as smart. My standoffish personality was a lot of my problem with women. In fact, it was a lot of my problem with people in general. Cool-headed, big-picture analysis is a real advantage if you are coordinating defensive swaps in lacrosse. But I think you can see how intellectual detachment becomes a roadblock if you are trying to get laid. I could never just lose myself in the experience. Let it all hang out, so to speak. That's a nerd thing. All of us intellectuals are uncomfortable with loss of control. We feel off balance if we react to things with unbridled passion rather than logic, almost guilty. I had a few partners prior to Karen's time. I was a senior and a varsity athlete, for Christ's sake. Lacrosse is a minor sport, but its gear has the macho helmets and padding of hockey, and unlike hockey, you get to showcase your legs. Plus, there is no cooler weapon than a 6-foot-long defenseman's stick. The problem was that it's hard to screw somebody senseless if your mind's still engaged. So, I just didn't do it for my partners. Karen turned that situation around, and in doing so turned around my life. I had my own apartment. I was the worldly senior, remember? I'd planned to take Karen back there, if she was willing. I looked at her gorgeous face and said tentatively, "Should we go back to my place?" She said excitedly, "I thought you'd never ask." As usual, I'd underestimated her. It was understandable. I was naive back then, which, I guess, is another word for dense. Karen was from a small town in Northern California, and she was 4 months removed from her high school graduation. So, I just assumed that she was a poor little lost sheep alone on a big university campus, and I was the big bad worldly senior. At least that's what I'd supposed. You can blunder into things in the dark, and I was consistently in the dark when it came to my little friend. She proved it by dropping to her knees as soon as she got in the door. I was just processing that fact when she unzipped me and proceeded to rummage around in my boxers until she found what she was looking for. She pulled it out, eyed it critically, got a look of approval on her beautiful face, and proceeded to swallow it whole. Like I said, I'm self-conscious. I'd never been blown in my life. And here it was happening 3 feet inside my apartment door. The sensation of Karen's hot, wet mouth knocked me off balance. I stumbled backward a few steps, waving my arms like one of the Stooges, and plopped onto the couch. I had a tiny living room. Meantime, Karen never lost touch with the item that she was eagerly felleting. I felt like I was going to erupt like Old Faithful, just as things were reaching their thrilling climax, so to speak. Karen grabbed my throbbing member and squeezed. She held it in a death grip, gazing hungrily into my eyes. She said, "Can't have it going off too soon. It still has work to do." I was looking at the thing like it was something brand new, which indeed it was. I had never seen it that big and hard. Meanwhile, Karen stood, slid down her panties, threw one of her beautiful, shining legs over me, and proceeded to fish around between us. I felt her dainty hand seize my unit, and then it was engulfed in a silky furnace of carnal pleasure. She let out a groan that might have been heard all over campus. Then she said informatively, like I'd even thought about it, "Don't worry, I'm on the pill." I might have overanalyzed the situation. That is, if I'd been in my right mind. But fortunately, my entire blood supply was concentrated in a place other than my brain. Karen started to circle and grind my pole while making loud effort noises. It was like she was on a mission. 30 seconds later it was, mission accomplished. I normally don't last long. So, I was certain I would be a huge disappointment, especially after what she'd just done to me. But before that thought even crossed my mind, Karen's mouth dropped open, her eyes rolled into her head, and she produced a monstrous gasp. She hyperventilated and went completely rigid, every muscle straining. It was literally like the calm before the storm. Then she started yelling, yes. There was intense frantic quivering and a lot of moaning. Her passage felt like I was being licked by 1,000 eager puppy dogs. Then she hit me with a snapping turtle. Something down there clutched me with the grip of a gorilla, and I came so hard that I probably changed the atmospheric pressure in her womb. I grabbed her and plastered her hard, little body against mine. That was mainly to keep her from falling off my lap. Her orgasmic gyrations were getting out of control. We shook and groaned together. Finally, she collapsed bonelessly against me and I fell back on the couch totally drained. We both slowly came back to some semblance of sanity. I opened my eyes to see her staring solemnly at me. I said, "I have no words," and I didn't. I had just been destroyed by a 19-year-old girl who clearly knew a lot more about sex than I did. I wasn't a total idiot. At least I had enough sense to not ask her how she learned to screw like that. I knew that would imply things that would put me on very thin ice. So instead, I said, "You're amazing." Still, there were disturbing nooks and crannies in Karen's personal history that I needed to explore. That is, if our relationship was going any further. The one thing that we did accomplish was to change our status from study buddies to friends with benefits. I didn't miss the irony that we just turned around our relationship to worldly freshman and innocent senior. I would have thought about making us exclusive, but there was this remarkable new disparity between the two of us, at least when it came to sex. I know that girls get sexual experience earlier than boys, even the younger ones. That's because there's always a well-practiced fellow out there waiting to school them. On the other hand, back when I was 16, I had very few 21-year-old hotties offering to advance my education. And let's face it, girls in their teens are a lot more mature than guys anyhow. Karen had obviously had a cutting-edge course in sex from a knowledgeable teacher, and our relationship wasn't going to go any farther until I knew the whole story. That story turned out to be even more disturbing and involved than I'd thought, but at least it answered all of my questions. We had been screwing on a daily basis, just to relax and clear our minds before an honest-to-God study session, but the time was never right to ask. That opportunity finally presented itself on our next formal date night. I'd taken Karen to a party at the same fraternity and gotten the same reaction from the brothers. They descended on her in droves. But this time was different. Karen made it clear that she was only there to be with me. We were in one of those embraces that pass for dancing among the kids, her arms around my neck, my hands on her narrow waist. Her perfume was driving me into a rutting frenzy. The little devil that sits on my left shoulder who looked like Gollum from the Lords of the Rings was muttering, "Screw her, pump her, go precious on her ring." While the angel on my right shoulder who looked like Dr. Dre reminded me that we were standing in the middle of a bunch of sweating frat rats and that screwing her in a coat closet simply lacked class. "So," I said with lust dripping off every syllable, "let's go." Karen knew what that meant, and she was pumped. She looked me meaningfully in the eye, grabbed the front of my shirt, wordlessly yanked me off the dance floor and marched me out the door of the fraternity house. I wasn't protesting. As soon as we got to my little bedroom, Karen pushed me backward onto the bed. I was fully dressed as was she, but she was in no mood to wait. She jumped up on the bed, straddling me. Suddenly I felt the familiar heat and silkiness. She groaned loudly. We had a wild session, and she held me tight when she climaxed. Then she went limp on my chest with her insides still churning like the ocean in a Force 5 hurricane. My own consciousness was lying in about 1,000 pieces on the bed. I started the task of picking it up and putting it back together. The time was right. I thought, it's now or never. Karen came back to me almost immediately. She sighed deeply and rolled off onto the bed. She lay next to me panting, one arm over her eyes. I thought I'd wrap my curiosity in flattery. "So," I said idly, "how did you get to be such a fabulous lover? I've never met a woman so totally satisfying." Of course, that was a lie. My only sex up to that point had been short drunken gropes. I was hoping that Karen's outstanding skill set didn't involve the crew of an aircraft carrier, but I was willing to live with whatever she told me. I was that smitten. That's when I heard about Jacques. I already knew that Karen was from California, and I knew that she was 1 year older than your average freshman. What I didn't know was that she had spent a year abroad. It seems that her parents had grown concerned that their precocious little 18-year-old darling was a bit overinterested in the wrong kind of guy. They also wanted to teach her how a rich young lady ought to behave. They were that upper crust. So, they took the steps to get Karen as far away from her unsavory friend as possible. Specifically, they packed her off to Villers-sur-Glâne for a little bit of finishing. Villers has very expensive boarding schools, and it's situated on top of a Swiss Alp. What could possibly go wrong in that scenario? Well, there might not be boys within miles, either vertically or horizontally. But there were male teachers, and Karen was a rare prize. Karen's tutor was named Jacques. He was 45 years old and French. I think you can see where this is heading. Jacques took one look at Karen and seduced her. It was the hoary old, "Come over to my place for some tutoring" gambit. They split a bottle of red, and one thing led to a carefully choreographed other. The two of them spent every night for the rest of the school year screwing. Jacques' culture and sophistication made Karen starry-eyed. He, in turn, taught her about sensual pleasure. All in all, Karen's trip to that Swiss prep school was an extremely educational experience. In that, a 45-year-old French master of the art gave her an intensive 1-year lesson in everything that she would ever need to know about sex. Karen slowly turned her head to study my face. She needed to see my reactions. She knew that telling me her story would blow my mind. So, she wanted to be as careful as possible, hoping that I would understand the stakes for us. She added simply, "Jacques didn't love me. There was far too much difference in age for that. But he did teach me how to love." She continued, looking me directly in the eye. "Like anybody else, I had to learn how to be a lover. The act itself can involve many different, sometimes conflicting things for a woman. From self-loathing to ignorance, lust, dominance, and manipulation." She said brightly, "It can also be a true act of giving. That depends on your attitudes and how you channel them. But it mainly depends on the man you are with." Jacques knew how to make love to me, not just screw me. That explained why she saw through Montana so fast. Karen added frankly, "We would meet in his chalet, and he would gently and knowledgeably lead me to feelings that I had never had before. I have to admit that I couldn't get enough of it. As a result, I was totally devoted to him." Her voice turned nostalgic as she said, "It was almost like coming off a narcotic drug when I returned home. He had a wife, of course. So, my departure was a given. But it was Jacques who gave me the ability to understand and accept my sexuality." Seriously? The little voice in my head thought that maybe I should send the guy a card, perhaps candy or flowers. My sweet little girlfriend ended with, "For a woman." Closeness, the ability to feel a connection with the other person, is the essential part of making love. It is one of the reasons why I am devoted to you now. Devoted? You know how you can sometimes intuit that something is true? Well, I was utterly certain that Karen believed what she had just said. Whether that feeling was reciprocated remained to be seen. My dilemma was that the woman I had fallen in love with was a full-fledged Jedi master of sex, honed to absolute perfection by a cheese-eating version of Yoda. Come, or come not, there is no try. In my mind, Karen's enhanced capabilities weren't a sign of a moral defect. In fact, it reinforced the belief that she was trustworthy. She had conducted a committed adult relationship, as doomed as that connection was from the start. She was with just one man, and she gave her heart to him. In fact, there had only been 3 men in Karen's life total: the aforementioned wrong sort of guy, the inimitable Jacques, and me. Whereas, I had been with more than twice that number of no doubt unsatisfied females. Of course, the quality of the sex with Karen was light years apart, and there was no comparing the degree of connection during the actual act itself. More importantly, the U might be a big campus, but the Grapevine is decidedly small town. So, we residents of the treehouse always hear about any exceptional performances. What? Do you really think that horny 20-something guys attend college because of their devotion to the liberal arts? But I digress. Anyhow, an exhibition of my sweet girlfriend's particular set of skills would have generated more headlines than the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and I hadn't heard a peep. Still, I think you can see my problem. Chronologically, I was 2 years older than Karen, but on the sexual maturity scale, I was at least a couple of decades less experienced. Even worse, short of hiring myself out as a boy toy for Madonna, I was never going to close that gap. The obvious question was, why would it matter? I was the lucky beneficiary of Karen's year of intensive training. Well, the obvious first concern was that I wasn't Jacques. I was just me, and the girl I loved was light years out of my league in one critical part of our relationship. I propped myself up on an elbow and looked down at her naked little body. It was the striking contradiction. That is the female form, hard and soft, wide and narrow, flat and round, solid and flexible. I said cautiously, if you had such an intense physical relationship with your tutor, wouldn't you be constantly comparing me to him? I love you, but I'm never going to be able to give you the sexual experiences you had in Switzerland. How can we build a life together if you are always comparing us? Karen laughed out loud. That hurt. She said, still laughing, Jacques was a man of great wisdom. He knew exactly what a woman wanted and how to give it to her. But he was no more or less well endowed than you. He had a giant French honker and male pattern baldness. He was 45 years old, 5'7", and perhaps 150 pounds soaking wet. She rolled over, hoisted herself up, threw a leg over me and straddled my hips. Then, she placed her still hot mound against my totally drained unit and braced her hands above my shoulders. She tinted her hair around both of us and positioned her face 6 inches from mine. My girlfriend was going to make a robust point. She said, "You are 6'1" and 200 pounds of rock-hard muscle. You have a noble Anglo-Saxon beak and no hair. But that's because it's a buzz cut. So yes, I compare you two all the time and you always win." Then she added, fiercely, "The difference between Jacques and you is that you and I have a future. We are similar people with the same values. You can learn the things that he taught me. All you have to do is give us time." Okay, that made a whole lot of sense. By now my inner devil, who now looked like Voldemort, started saying, "You have now matured to next level. Now kiss her and go for round 2. And my angel, who now looked like Nathan Evans, just started singing, "Leave her, Johnny. Leave her." Only time would tell. But at that point in our relationship, I was not stupid enough to look a gift horse in the mouth. I said, "I have felt a close connection to you from the moment we met. We think alike, we enjoy each other's company, and we both have the same tastes and interests." Then I hesitated. This was the point where I was going to go all in. I said, "I could spend the rest of my life looking for somebody as well-matched as you, and I'd never find her. We just get each other. I understand that. So, we belong with each other." Karen nodded her head eagerly. I could tell that was what she was alluding to when she used the terms similar and future to describe the conditions for us being together. Trust requires faith, and there was something in our subliminal connection that gave me a nascent belief in our long-term prospects. Karen was right, of course. Sex is part of it, but relationships that are built strictly on sex don't last. Ours was one of mutual respect and shared interest. Hence, as they say in golf and other sports, never up, never in. And so, the lessons began. We were married the month after I graduated. Karen still had 6 years to get her law degree. I was stuck on campus anyhow. So, I decided to go all the way for a doctorate. In a lot of respects, those were the best years of our lives. We had the normal existence in a married housing ghetto. Everybody in that overeducated assemblage of tiny apartments subsisted on ramen noodles and cheap red wine. It was a point of pride. We worked hard and made love every night. Karen was a demanding teacher. Still, higher learning is a cruel mistress, and we were both away a lot. I spent more time than I wanted to in the computer lab. Computers weren't carried around in your pocket like they are now. So, I had to be someplace that had a connection to the mainframe. Karen was constantly in class, in the law library, or in study groups. Those groups frequently met in a little outdoor Italian joint that served sangria in pitchers. It was right across the parking lot from the law school. I'd usually meet Karen there when I got out of the lab. I was doing an extended run on a big dataset, and the lab's 3081D was a ponderous beast. So instead of getting out at 4 o'clock, like I expected, it was closer to 6:30. I hustled over to the law school and parked our battered old Mazda GLC in the only spot available. It was way over on the street side of the lot, away from the law school building, facing the Italian bistro. I could see Karen sitting at an outdoor table with the dinner leavings of a lot of people scattered around. She was alone. Her head was bowed, hair obscuring her face. It was like she couldn't hold it up. A dude named Eric was sitting next to her. I had met Eric several times in the past, and he struck me as the kind of douchebag who got off on counting coup on married women. Karen was the sort of girl he would no doubt find challenging, even if he didn't know about her hidden talents. I walked up behind the couple. Dipshit had Karen by the shoulders like he was trying to move her. She, in turn, wasn't cooperating. His voice was wheedling. "Come on, Karen. My place is right around the corner. You can call your husband from there. You need to lie down." I stood directly behind him and said, "No need for that. I'm here now. Sorry about the delay." His head whipped around. I was standing far enough behind him that he had to shift in his chair. He gave me a caught with his hand in the cookie jar smirk. I gave him a hard stare that said, "Back off, punk." He was my height and perhaps 30 pounds of blubber heavier, with a carefully honed Ivy League look. Middle-parted hair, tailored cotton white shirt, whipcord khakis, Oxford brown penny loafers, and the Trap P3 tortoiseshell glasses that all the good little preppies wear. He even had the requisite florid, very smooth, almost translucent skin that screamed, "Never worked outside a day in my life." He wouldn't be challenging me. Karen mumbled, "Honey, where have you been?" Then she added, mystified, "I'm drunk." I said lovingly, "I can see that, babe. Let me get you to the car, and we can sober you up when we get home. How about a nice hot shower?" I gave Shitface a look that said, "And I'll be soaping her back and other things." Karen continued to whine, "Honey, I'm drunk." I was gently helping her stumble toward our ancient hoop tie. I said, "How much did you drink? It isn't even 7 o'clock?" She shook her head and said, "Dunno." My glass was always full. I wrote down a little note to self that said, "Have heart-to-heart with Frodo Douchebaggins." We just made it inside our little apartment when Karen sagged against me and passed out. I found myself in a pitch-dark room holding a 110-pound sack of potatoes. The problem with cheap student housing is that the rooms are small. I mean, it's designed to be low cost. Hence, I was pretty sure that if I tried to swing Karen up and carry her to bed Fabio style, I would either fracture her skull or knock over one of the lamps. My best option was to throw my arms around her ample chest and walk her down the hall like a puppet. Unfortunately, that embedded my crotch between her rock-hard buns, and the last thing I wanted to have happen was precisely what sprang to life in my pants. As I walked my poor dead wife down the hall, the twitching of her but made my little fellow grow ginormous. And to make the problem even worse, she started to make noises like she liked it. So, by the time I got her to her side of bed, I felt like we ought to have a post-coital cigarette. I eased her onto the pillow and pulled her feet up on the bed. She was out cold, and I considered just leaving her that way. I was a little disgusted with her, to tell the truth, but she was down for the count, and I didn't want her to wake up in her clothes. So, I carefully unstrapped her sandals and eased them off her feet. Karen was a dancer for a lot of years, which explained her magnificent hard body. It also explained her feet, which are the price that a dancer pays for having that body. Looking at them, I couldn't help but give the poor things a quick massage, and I got a long and contented sigh for my efforts. Getting the rest of her clothes off, which included a very sexy thong, took a little wrestling, but I finally had my wife stripped naked and under the covers. Of course, being the good husband that I am, I had to carefully examine her body to check for any, damage. I marveled at how totally feminine she was. Meanwhile, Karen was snoring like a lumberjack and mumbling something in her sleep about ducks. I closed the door and sat down in my chair to think. I had always been aware that I was punching above my weight with Karen. Looks, personal presence, and maybe smarts. But we had so much in common in every other aspect of our lives that the connection seemed unbreakable. However, none of the predators knew that. Every guy wants a woman as gorgeous as Karen, but they are also aware that every other male in the room wants her too. The hunter just sees a hot female and a basically geeky grad student with almost no spendable cash and a lot of demands on his time. So, why not take a chance? It was the old question of faith. I was going to run the current varmint off, but I would have to trust Karen's personal integrity to preserve my happy life. I thought about it a bit. We both understood how tight our bond was, and it was that deep personal connection that I was counting on. Of course, she'd also given me no reason to doubt her. In fact, in the period after Karen's great revelation, we'd actually talked about the ground rules for the fidelity element of our relationship. The two of us are polar opposites. Yet, rather than that being a bone of contention, we each recognized that our dissimilar natures filled in the bumps in life for both of us. It made us essential to each other. Karen made my life vital and interesting. I'm laid back and cerebral. I live in my head. It's a nerd thing. So, I miss a lot. My wife has a discriminating social eye, and she can explain incomprehensible things to me, like sarcasm, which I always took literally. My role was to recurrently peel Karen off the ceiling. She's passionate and energetic. Her emotions are what power her extraordinary sexuality, and it freaks her out to get patted on the head by life. She, quite rightly, feels condescended to. So, every time somebody patronized her, I had to point out that was a tactic designed to keep a beautiful woman in her place. I eventually convinced her that passive-aggressive, not confrontation, was the best way to suffer fools. I would come to regret cluing her in on that, but that was much later. It was almost midnight. So, I went to bed still confident in my marriage and my wife. I got a good night's sleep lying next to her corpse. She didn't move once all night. I had been up a couple of hours when the spitting image of the term, death warmed over, emerged from our little bedroom. I said cheerily, "You're up." That was mean, but she deserved it. She moaned and plopped down in the other kitchen chair, dropping her head on her folded arms. She said plaintively, "Kill me now." I said, keeping up my irritatingly sprightly manner, "You look a bit hungover." She propped one eye open and eyed me hostilely. She said, "It's like somebody's scrubbing the veins in my brain with a rusty pipe cleaner." Then she got a stricken look, popped to her feet, and disappeared into our little bathroom. The next 5 minutes featured the sounds of garish yakking. I heard the toilet flush, and my beautiful wife emerged looking grayish. I plopped a couple of pieces of dry toast down in front of her, added a steaming cup of black coffee, and said, "Try this, you'll feel better. Then, let's talk." I was sitting in our living room, doing some calculus homework, when Karen emerged. She was wrapped in her ratty old bathrobe. Her hair was a mess, and she looked like she'd spent a very rough night. But she was ready to talk. I said, "You know what that guy was up to, right?" She got a grimace on her face and said, "Is there anybody you can trust? He's the editor of the Law Review. He told me that he took special interest in me because of my performance in moot court." I laughed and said, "That line probably dates back to Caligula." She said earnestly, "Nothing was ever going to happen. I wasn't going to go anywhere with him. You know that, right?" This was an important moment. We both recognized what she was asking, and my reply was going to set the tone for our long-term future. Mutual respect is the bedrock of marriage. That's because respect underwrites trust. If you truly believe in the other person's inherent honor and dignity, then you can be certain that they'll make the right decision. More importantly, you have to let them know that you believe in them. Hence, the absolutely wrong thing to say would be, "Well, you're really hot and you were pretty drunk." Instead, I said, "Duh." If you're asking me whether I think you'd blow up our life to have drunken sex with a random stranger, then my answer is, of course not. I know that you value yourself and what we have more than that. I paused to make a point. I also know that you're experienced enough that the only way something like that would ever happen would be if you wanted it to. And I count on the life we've built together to ensure that you don't ever get close to that line. In my not-so-humble opinion, the two of us moved to another level at that moment. My acknowledging that reciprocal restraint was an integral part of our relationship let Karen know that I understood the importance of our mutual pledge. It also let her know how I felt about either of us breaking it. I didn't go out of my way to test our understanding, but stuff will inevitably happen. The one thing that mainframes did a lot back in the good old days was crash. We suffered a fatal Stack Overflow, and the only way to get the thing working again was a cold start. So, we researchers found ourselves at Liberty while the system staff beat on the CPU with the proverbial monkey wrench. I drifted over to the law school to see if my lady love was free for the day. The kid at the desk in the law library said that the second-year students were all at Dominic's. So, I moseyed in that direction. As I walked up the street, I could see Karen sitting at the same table on the patio. As she'd gotten older, Karen's beauty had developed into something special. She'd cut her thick blonde hair down to shoulder length with bangs that made her look sleek and sophisticated. Her round face had lengthened a bit, and it now featured two superbly proportioned cheekbones and a distinctively pointed chin. Include her big blue eyes and wide sensual mouth in the picture, and my wife was a stunningly attractive woman. There were about a dozen students sitting around the table with books and yellow legal pads. Douchebag was sitting next to Karen. I didn't like the proprietary look on his face. He would occasionally lean in to talk to her. I could tell that bothered my wife by the way she would lean away. I was just crossing the street when she jumped to her feet and began to animatedly yell at the piece of shit. The other students were staring at the two of them in amazement. Then Karen went stomping out of the place in the direction of the parking lot, which was in front of me and to my left. I had just gotten to the restaurant as she crossed the street, marching in the opposite direction. So, I hustled to catch up. I came up behind her as she marched along, radiating pissed off. Karen is tiny compared to me, but she was intimidatingly angry. When I caught up to her, I asked her the obvious question, "What happened back there?" At the sound of my voice, she stopped and turned startled. She said, "What are you doing here, Chris?" I said, "The system croaked. So, I'm done for the day. What happened to make you so mad?" She said angrily, "That asshole tried to grope me under the table. What did he expect me to do? Clear off all the books and screw him right there?" As we continued to walk toward the car, Karen was muttering under her breath, "Touch, touch, touch. It's all you men ever do." I said, "Do you want me to have a little heart-to-heart with him?" She sputtered, "I can fight my own battles. I'm done with that study group, and I'm going to talk to the dean about him." I don't know why the whole incident made me feel so good. Maybe it was the reaffirmation of my wife's commitment and common sense. Or maybe it was the amazing jungle sex that happened when we got home. Karen had some serious anger issues to work out. There are a lot of neat cities that a newly minted lawyer can end up in: New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas. But we chose Washington, D.C. It made sense. I had an offer at Georgetown, and Karen had gotten a position as a staff legal advisor for the Senate Armed Services Committee. That was no coincidence. Karen's parents were big contributors to the chairman's re-election committee. We didn't have much money, so we rented a place in New Carrollton near the metro station. We could commute in on the Orange Line. Karen would get off at Capitol South and walk over to the Russell Building. I'd continue on to Foggy Bottom. I'd parked a bike at GWU. From there, it was a relatively hassle-free ride down Pennsylvania and up M to the Georgetown campus. Karen had enough ambition for both of us. Hence, locating herself where all of the levers get pulled was just another step in her climb to self-actualization. Me? I kind of fell into the situation at Georgetown. I wish I could say that it was due to good planning, but it was more a matter of talking to the right guy at the right conference. But it was a perfect job for a guy who marched to a different drummer, not the one frantically beating out the cadence for his wife. I taught and researched data mining. No, that doesn't involve a hard hat and a canary. Every loyalty card and digital device gathers and reports data about you. That's your digital footprint. All that personal information is kept in virtual warehouses where people like me run sophisticated analytics on it. That's data mining. It's a form of weird science. We use what you reveal to us through your past behavior to shape your future actions. I was researching subliminal ways to make you vote for the candidate of my choice. That might sound like something Dr. Evil might do, but really, I'm just a nerd. And nerds don't care what other people do with their research. Think Werner von Braun, for instance. Of course, all my tinkering was taking place on academic time, which isn't exactly real time. Karen worked lawyer's hours. Her average week was twice mine. So, I was alone a lot. I didn't mind. I was perfectly comfortable puttering around in my head. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. I wasn't remotely concerned about Karen playing patty cake during the long hours apart. She rarely had time for bathroom breaks, let alone afternoon delights. Still, the outrageous hours that she put in didn't faze her. They energized her. She was doing important work, the stuff that you read about in the Post. Most days, my wife would appear for our 7 o'clock dinner with tales of Byzantine maneuvering and outrageous largesse, all wrapped in intrigue and backstabbing. Like most DC hands, she viewed that carnage with the macabre cynicism that passes for humor. Actually, Karen started to lean on me more as time passed. Her job was stressful, and her work environment wasn't exactly laid back. What with the fine collection of partisan warriors that inhabited it? Consequently, Karen viewed me and our little home as a safe harbor where she could relax and recenter herself after an invigorating day of swine wrestling. Our life went along beautifully for 9 years. We had plenty of happy, relaxed, and loving moments. Karen rocked my world on a regular basis. We talked and bantered, and our connection grew. The two of us were well established by that point. So, we bought a townhome in Greenbelt. It was a bit longer commute on the Green Line, but the price was affordable, and the place was brand new. Plus, you could literally walk next door to the metro. We had just celebrated our 14th wedding anniversary when the serpent slithered into the garden. I'd recently completed the 10-year rat race. It's an agonizing, slow-motion process, but it's the critical hurdle. Since, outside of the Vatican, there are very few people who know that they'll have a job for life. Now, I was tenured and short of getting caught doing unnatural things to farm animals. They couldn't fire me. Karen took time off to celebrate. Normally, she wasn't even out of the office at 5:30, but I had leapt over the single biggest barrier for an academic. It was a major triumph. So, she met me at Clyde's for a rare early evening dinner. We were sharing a platter of their legendary steak tips when we were approached by Robert, don't call me Bob, Hazelton, one of the political hacks who infest the Hill. He looked like a Labrador retriever with a bird in his mouth. Karen stood up, did the cheek kissing that passes for another part of the anatomy, and said, "Robert, what a pleasant surprise." It wasn't. Robert Don't Call Me Bob was a congressional power player and a fellow who was the quintessential essence of the term arrogant shithead. Hazelton said, pointedly ignoring me, "I'm glad I spotted you here, Karen. I was just talking about you." He added inquiringly, "You work for Senate Armed Services, right?" Karen said, "Yes, I'm on the legal staff. Why?" Hazelton said, "Missy Pleasance is retiring as Chief of Staff for Lawton McGee." That made sense. The old bat must have begun her career during the Johnson administration. That's Andrew, not Lyndon. McGee was the majority leader. He was also an absolute master of narcissistic, self-promoting political stunts and king of the dirty tricks and bullying that we have all come to fondly associate with 21st century governance. Karen said, puzzled, "What does that have to do with me?" Hazelton said, "We're wrapping up some important legislation and we need an energetic chick to push it. Lawton thinks that you're just the girl." That statement had so many things wrong with it that I thought Karen wouldn't even reply. She surprised me by saying, "Go ahead, I'm listening." Hazelton got the same look that a boa constrictor gets when it begins to wrap its coils around a hapless victim. He said, still not acknowledging my presence, "I need an answer by tomorrow. This is very time sensitive." So, Hazelton was trying to stuff my wife into the proverbial barrel before she realized what "headed over the waterfall" really meant. She looked at me and said, "My husband and I will have to talk about it, but I'm interested." That was a surprise. Karen normally has nothing good to say about the denizens of Capitol Hill, and now she was considering joining the club. We should have been thrilled. Working for a congressman used to be the pinnacle of success. You made the laws. People saw you as a person of respect. Now, you were part of a group that 8 out of 10 people view as lying varmintitos. Naturally, with the unseemly, partisan bickering, self-important political posturing, and all of the obvious efforts to peddle influence, it's hard to fault the American people for their attitude. We talked on the way back. I said, "Do you really want to do this? You're going to change the dynamics of your life if you get out of the executive side and onto the political side." Karen gave me a grim smile and said, "I know what you're talking about, but nothing is ever going to change if good people don't step up. So, I see it as my civic duty." Of course, the road to hell is paved with those kind of intentions, and almost every conversation that begins with, "Whatever were you thinking?" ends with, "It seemed like a good idea at the time." Thanks to the 20th Amendment, Karen showed up at the Cannon office building bright and early on January the 3rd. That's the day they swear in the new Congress. Because all of the reps are elected to 2-year terms, McGee had to go through the same swearing and ceremony as the freshmen, even though it was the 15th time he promised to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, blah blah blah. Following that sham event, my wife found herself the girl Friday to a very important dude. Even better, at least from Karen's perspective. She was the one who was actually steering the ship. I hate to disillusion you, but most of the esteemed members of Congress spend their time politicking rather than actually tending to business. It's the staff who sweat the details. In fact, the member rarely reads what he's pushing. His job is to do the public posturing and get reelected. You see pictures on Politico of the great man, striding the halls of Congress, and you don't notice the herd of people surrounding him. Those are his staffers. They're the ones putting the words in his mouth. Karen was McGee's chief of staff. The chief of staff is supposedly the single point of contact between the great man and the rest of his people. At least that's the idea. But Karen had a room full of old hands, and they had no problem walking right past her to bang on McGee's door. So, the very first thing my wife did was hold a come to Jesus, where she laid down the law about who got to talk to McGee and when. Following her little sermon, she established her own office in the glassed-in space behind the receptionist. That's the public area. Hence, Karen was the only person sitting between the staff offices on her right and the member's private office on her left. Then, the first staffer who crossed the reception area without checking with her got a royal reaming about chain of command. Karen didn't need to provide any more illustrations after that public horsewhipping. It was a gutsy move, since my wife was the new girl and also, with the exception of the interns, the youngest person on the staff. Of course, she was also the smartest, toughest, and by far the most attractive woman in an office full of ancient warhorses, both male and female. McGee might be 68 years old, but everybody in the whole wide world knew that he had an eye for the ladies. Karen had a brilliant and well-honed legal mind, and she had a reputation for hard work. But she is also flat-out gorgeous. I'm sure that was the main distinction between her and any of the other eager beaver candidates for the job. And don't get me wrong, DC might be a den of iniquity, but the 7th is not the commandment that's most frequently broken. It's the 8th, 9th, and 10th. And if money's a graven image, then you can throw in the 1st and 2nd. In fact, anybody who thinks there's a constant flow of illicit nookie on Capitol Hill doesn't understand how modern politics works. In this gotcha culture of 24-hour electoral discourse, everybody who is worth watching is stalked by a ravening pack of newsies. Thus, screwing a staffer is a crazy risky thing to do. Ask Bill Clinton how that worked for him. On the other hand, given the reality of the Hill, Karen was clearly McGee's work wife. In fact, he saw a lot more of her than I did. That really wasn't an issue as long as the two of us still had some time together, and I'm not talking about the sex. Couples choose each other for intangible reasons. In fact, unless your relationship is messed up from the get-go, there is always something special that connects the two of you. Those are the little nuances that are uniquely personal, and they keep you genuinely satisfied with each other. No matter what those factors might be, there's the feeling of safety and comfort when you're around each other. It's the only time that you are unreservedly content. When Karen and I were alone, it was like the two of us were back together sitting in the library. There was genuine, simple affection, without any need to pose or preen. We could both be ourselves, not the facade that we put on for the rest of the world. Those were the times that kept us both loving and sane. The shields drain your psychic energy. So, the ability to lower them is critical to a person's mental health. And Karen and I had always been able to compartmentalize our special moments together. I think all successful couples do that. Academic life gives people insane amounts of money for very little actual work, but it's like running with a pack of wild dogs. Your survival depends on your ability to project total dominance, and your peers will tear you to pieces if they sense even a shred of doubt. Hence, there is probably no profession that depends more on sheer arrogance than the professoriate. That might be a horribly cynical way to portray major league higher education, but that's the way it works. It's just a necessary part of doing business. Still, the haughty and intimidating armor that I strap on every morning is there to protect the real me, and I'm just as geeky and clueless as I ever was. The same's true with Karen. My wife's public persona isn't anybody you'd ever want to mess with. Political life's a bitch. People are constantly trying to take a piece off you, and you constantly have to protect yourself, because nobody else will. So, at work, Karen's poke salad Annie. Lord have mercy. A straight razor Totten woman. Even the gators are afraid of her. Of course, that was just the face that she had to wear to survive and prosper in the bloodthirsty world of big-stakes politics. At home, my wife was still the sweet, funny, and overly affectionate little woman I fell in love with those many years ago. The problem was that our alone time was coming less and less. At first, I thought that it was due to the stress of Karen's new life. During the slack times, the demands were merely crazy. When they were building the budget or planning the next campaign, she would be home perhaps 6 hours a night to sleep. I didn't get the sense Karen's relationship with McGee was the cause. Most of her intimate conversations with him were along the lines of how to manipulate situations for political gain. There simply wasn't any chemistry. In fact, Karen had the same attitude toward McGee as she had toward the guy who was after her in law school. It ranged from dismissive to a little pissed off, especially if the old goat's wife was in the room. But Karen was willing to provide the arm candy for the privilege of being in charge. McGee didn't seem to care that the whole wide world knew that Karen wasn't screwing him. He was at that stage in life where just having a beautiful woman at his beck and call fed his ego. That's a true fact of life with the DC elite. Just swing by the DC Army-Navy Club on any given evening, and you'll see a lot of geriatric white boys taking their granddaughters to dinner. The distance Karen put between her boss and herself was an added bonus for him, since it didn't give the bottom feeders like Drudge, Breitbart, or the Inquirer any red meat. The only thing those rags could do was speculate about who McGee's beautiful new chief of staff was. Naturally, there were the usual paparazzi. I even had a reporter stand up in the back of one of my lectures and ask me what I thought about my wife being seen so often with Loudon McGee. I told him the truth, it's her job. Besides convincing the student body that their prof was a closet stud, Karen spent the weekend trying to screw me to death. She said that she was grateful to have a husband who, got it? The excitement of Karen hitting the Washington A-list eventually died down. So, she could get back to the business of running the country, or at least the part that fell under her boss's purview. That was the House Armed Services Committee, which was pretty heady stuff since it oversaw every element of the U.S. military except the Coast Guard. Karen also spent time on the road because of McGee's need to get reelected. When you think of Michigan, you usually conjure up Motown, or maybe Wolverine football. But the slogan that describes the northern part of that state is, "Paddle faster, I hear banjos." That's particularly true for McGee's district, which was way up north. In McGee's district, men are men, women are subservient. Eisenhower is in the White House and federal assistance is every citizen's God-given right. So, McGee kept himself in office by fighting to keep his constituents' disability money out of the hands of foreigners and upholding the freedom to bear AR-15s with Drum magazine. Still, once in a while Karen's boss would have to take off his $4,000 suit, jump in his private jet, and sit around a greasy spoon in Sheboygan, just to remind the voters of his efforts on their behalf. Karen had to be on those trips. Like I said, it was her job. I wasn't worried about her screwing anybody. The congressman's toadies and advance men were masters of the fine art of backstabbing. Karen knew that as well as I did, and she was way too smart to end up on TMZ because she wandered off the reservation. Still, after a few of her adventures into the other America, it was clear that my wife was buying into the party line. So, Karen and I had our first real arguments about her endorsement of McGee's over-flexible views about the way the ends justified the means. It was disquieting.
I'm Aned. I'm totally apolitical.
I could care less who's running things, or what their ideology is. But Karen was starting to sound more and more like her boss. And he was a proponent of the type of gunboat diplomacy that hadn't been talked about in this country since the halcyon days of Teddy Roosevelt. McGee was also clearly crooked. He had been a small-town mayor before his elevation to Congress. Yet, in his 30 years as a member of that august body, he had amassed a vast fortune. All of it on a salary of $174,000 a year. Of course, he was a canny old dude. Hence, he was more or less immune to the feet of clay syndrome that affected some of the dumber or greedier members of the old boys club. The problem was that Karen was fascinated by importance. She was drawn to it like the proverbial moth to the flame. And I was definitely not the candle type. So, when we argued, I could sense that we were slowly drifting apart. We were both at the stage in life when our present actions would more or less dictate how we finished the race. Obviously, Karen's desire to change the world demanded that she hitch her wagon to power. That was McGee, and therein lay the rub. As somebody once said, I just didn't view moving and shaking as part of my remit. So, it was no doubt inevitable that our divergent personalities and career paths would lead us in different directions. The last straw came when she announced that she was taking a week-long trip to Sharm el-Sheikh. Karen said that she was doing it on behalf of the esteemed member of Congress. The obvious concern was, why would a guy who represents a constituency whose worldview didn't extend much past deer hunting season want to talk to people on the butt end of the Sinai? Karen told me that she was going as McGee's representative to tripartite talks on the future of intelligence sharing among the Arab League states, and that Sharm el-Sheikh was the Miami Beach of the Red Sea. Since McGee was chair of House Armed Services, the idea that his chief of staff was involved in efforts to hammer out a multilateral agreement with the major Arab countries made a convincing argument, particularly since McGee wasn't traveling with her. His absence also cemented the idea that Karen was starting to swim in the big boys' end of the pool. Still, we had lived together for almost 17 years. You can tell when your soulmate isn't quite right. And Karen was radiating the vibes that she was into something illicit. In fact, Everything about the whole gambit sounded wrong. My wife was a doer and a fixer, not a diplomat. Even worse, she was flying by Gulfstream 4, which is reserved for the heavy hitters, not a staffer. More significantly, that type of international travel was also out of McGee's league. So, this trip was at the behest of somebody else, somebody who was much more powerful. In fact, it had all the earmarks of a tit for tat. It's never about the sex in one of those situations. It's about the influence. That just greases the skids for the real negotiation. I'm not the kind of insecure weenie who jumps to conclusions. But in this case, the deduction was pretty elementary. And our marriage was toast if my suspicions were correct. We'd been married for a long time, and Karen had always been steadfast. But people fake road trips all the time, and she had a burning lust to make a difference. I couldn't help her, but her beauty had always attracted predators. So, maybe she'd run into somebody who could. The problem was that I couldn't confront her based on a simple hunch. I'd sound like a paranoid wussy if I did. I'd rolled the dice with her before and come up, lucky 7. Now, I was going to have to roll them again and hope I didn't crap out. Karen planned to be gone Sunday through Saturday. Hence, I set up one of our rare special evenings on the night before she left. There was no way she could claim to be busy and still look me in the eye. I'd arranged a reservation at the Capitol Grill over on Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place that only a lobbyist can afford. But I wanted to make our last night memorable, if this was truly the end of things. Karen was sitting opposite me looking stunning in a little black dress. There was no sign of the innocent freshman I had met almost 20 years ago. The girl next door had morphed into a woman of eye-watering beauty. It's Karen's perfection that makes her so intimidating. Her face is flawlessly proportioned. Her makeup is immaculate. Her hair is a thick, shining, golden cowl, and her attitude is always self-possessed and serene. Karen is a woman who knows who she is. She had always been confident, even when we were young. But the past year had given her an extra jolt of personal charisma. She was gazing across the table with deep affection. I should have been content to know that she'd given me her heart. Instead, I smelled a rat. Nonetheless, I was committed to not sending the love of my life off to who knows where, thinking I was an a-hole. So, I started with a simple, tell me about this trip. What are you planning to do while you're over there? It's interesting thinking that you were going to such an exotic place. Karen's face, which had been glowing with love a microsecond earlier, totally shut down. She said abruptly, "You know I can't talk about those things. It's classified." Her tone told me that she would have to kill me afterward. I said defensively, "It's a diplomatic mission, isn't it? Why is it so top secret? Hush hush." She looked at me blandly and said ipso facto, "Just because it is. Everything over there is sensitive, and it's especially difficult for me because I'm a woman. This trip is upsetting to me. So, I have to ask you to stop talking about it." I interpreted that as, "It really bothers me to betray you. So, let's move on to happier topics." She didn't want me to remind her about what she was about to do, which was a pure sign of innate guilt. Well, at least she was suffering some pangs of regret. Personally, I was feeling more and more hopeless, but I had to hold on to my cards. I couldn't give her any hint that I suspected something was wrong. That is, if I wanted to spring the trap that I was planning. I said, smiling weakly, "Okay, do you want to talk about getting away for a while when you get back?" I knew from our recent history that idea would be a total non-starter, but I still wanted to see how Karen would react. She looked horrified and said, "I can't even think about that right now. I love you, but I'm in the middle of something very important, and I have to give it my full attention." Then she added with a glorious smile, "Let's run away to some place like St. Lucia once I get things arranged, get naked, live on the beach, not even think about anything other than where we're going to have dinner." Now that was an outright astonishing statement, given that she was planning to get naked and live on a beach with somebody else for the next week. I really didn't like being an object of pity. So, I laid down one of my prime cards. I said, "I'm just worried that I might be losing you to another man." It was clear that was the last thing Karen thought I'd say. Her creamy skin went deep red right down to her superb cleavage, and she said emphatically, "You'll never lose me. I'm yours forever. That isn't what this is about. I just need to do this to fulfill a promise that I made to myself." She looked at me searchingly and said, "You understand that, don't you? I swear that I am going to put my career on hold and concentrate on raising your children after this is over. But this is just something that I have to do to move on in life without regret." Well, no, I didn't understand that at all. If she thought that I would consent to her having a romantic fling as a prelude to moving on to motherhood, then there was one serious flaw in her logic. That would be the assumption that we would still be married when she got back. Karen casually dropped her clothes as soon as we got back to our place. Then she strolled over to the bed and lay down. I sat next to her and looked into her eyes. Desire was crouching there like a hungry predator. I stood and quietly undressed. Then I lay beside her. She scooted to accommodate me. Karen needs physical affirmation when she is feeling insecure. The more insecure she feels, the more she needs to have me inside her. It's like the physical connection reinforces our special bond. She held me tight and her hand was at the back of my neck, looking intently into my eyes, like she needed to find something there. I tried to communicate my love, but the sense that I was losing her released the beast. It was a rational and savage instinct, one that I'd never felt before. I heard a voice that must have been mine give a low, animalistic growl, and then I threw myself on top of her. Karen was no longer my lifelong friend and companion. She was my bitch. I had to breed her. I wanted to pound her like she was a red-hot horseshoe, and I was the blacksmith. My last rational image was the smirk of satisfaction that she got as I said about absolutely ravaging her. I normally know what Karen is doing while we had sex, but consciousness had long since left the building. All I could see was a lustful red haze. I felt a stirring in my groin that told me that great forces were about to be unleashed. The culmination was a cataclysmic eruption that would have rivaled Vesuvius standing on Krakatoa's shoulders. That added stars to the red firmament. I have never been so out of control in my life, and the climax was so violent that it actually hurt. I was having a hard time catching my breath. So, I lunged out of Karen to lie gasping on the bed next to her, not knowing whether she had climaxed or not, and not really caring at that point. I finally got enough awareness to roll on my side and look at her. She popped one eye open and looked at me with profound, smug, kitty-like satisfaction. I said, with sincerity, "I'm sorry if I hurt you." She looked at me like I was an idiot and said, "Hurt me? I just set a new record. It's nice to feel you lose control once in a while." I still didn't understand what had hit me. I guess jealousy and suspicion will do that to you. The fact that Karen's much smaller body could handle the pounding that I'd given her, and then like it enough to pass out, just reinforced the suspicion that women are a stronger and much superior version of the species. The problem was that my wife was leaving on a jet plane, and that would probably mark the end of our beautiful life together. The realization totally obliterated any ability to sleep. Karen was particularly misty-eyed as we hugged and kissed goodbye. She was flying out of the private facility on the south end of DCA. So, I just dropped her and drove around to the economy lot next to the TSA Integration Center. I didn't even need binoculars. I watched her departure through the 10x magnification of my iPhone. I needed a photographic record for the subsequent divorce proceedings. Karen emerged onto the tarmac, towing her roller bag and looking exotically beautiful. She was with a guy in a sharkskin suit. That's standard legal attire. It's hard to tell where the sharkskin leaves off and the lawyer begins. He didn't look like anybody I needed to worry about. He was almost effeminate. The Gulfstream started up, taxied out, lifted off the runway, and disappeared into the overcast. That officially marked the end of life as I knew it on this planet. I bid it a tearful farewell. Why was I being so melodramatic? Logically, a one-time fling is no big deal. Humans aren't naturally monogamous. It takes conscious effort to stay faithful. And that was exactly my point. Exclusivity is the foundation of partnership. Hence you can call it whatever you like. Alternate lifestyle, business arrangement, or whatever. But there is no marriage if there is no willingness to be exclusive. You have to know that your mate is wholly dedicated to your personal well-being, as much as you are to hers. There are no loopholes or conditions. The circumstance is just too important for gray areas. Karen and I used an image from Animal Planet to describe it. I know it sounds silly, but it was a perfect illustration of what marriage meant to us. Visualize a pair of Arctic oxen, standing steadfastly, back to back, horns pointed out, each resolutely defending the other's blind spot from the encircling wolves. That was Karen and me. I could always count on her, and she could count on me. That was why the idea of her loss overwhelmed me. So yeah, I cried a bit. I had given her my total devotion, and she had repaid me by running off to screw some big-time power player. How could I ever trust her after that? Well, I might not be influential, but nerds are known to be vicious when cornered. So, I dropped a rat, a him, a remote access Trojan, on her. Cheaters don't realize that the virtual world is full of rats. If so, there would be a lot less cheating. It might be ungentlemanly to bug your wife, but my heart had hardened. All I needed was Karen's password, which took John the Ripper all of 10 seconds to crack. Then, there could be no guessing. I would have the evidence. And, after that, there would be no point to our alleged marriage bond. Karen would have proven once and for all that our enduring alliance was a fraud. The rat ran in the background. So, it would cut into her battery life. But everything that happened near her would be recorded and periodically batch uploaded to the cloud. The uploads would max her data plan too, but the cell bill would be her problem. I didn't plan to go over the actual evidence until I needed it. Honestly, I just couldn't face witnessing my wife's betrayal in real time. I know that putting off the inevitable was a classic case of avoidance behavior, but come on. I was already dealing with a lot of shit. I didn't need any extra heartache. I had a busy week. I found a lawyer and the financial arrangements were completed. I also had to sit in our lonely house and eat my heart out. I don't think I slept more than 2 hours a night for the entire 7 days. At the end of the week, I was waiting outside the lower-level exit at Dulles for Karen to clear the CBP checkpoint. Even somebody coming back from a week of trashing her marriage has to go through passport control. The final act would take place once we got home. The control point doors were open. So, I saw Karen the instant she stepped into the exit tunnel. She looked radiantly beautiful and my heart flip-flopped in agony. She got a loving smile on her face as she started to race toward me, arms spread wide. But she never made it. Of all the government agencies, there's something about the FBI that screams Fed. I'd noticed a group of them gathered right at the exit point. They looked like a pack of eager foxhounds, baying for the start of the chase. I wondered what they were doing there. I found out as soon as Karen stepped into their jurisdiction. Suddenly, I was standing at the back of a swarming pack of feds, watching my wife being arrested. Karen's face went from loving, to confused, to nonplussed, to terrified. She gave me a panicked look as the Klingon grabbed her and hustled her out the door to their waiting collection of shiny black Suburbans. I stared at the receding crowd with a WTF look on my face. A couple of the older and more self-important types were briefing a bundle of reporters. I drifted over to where they were standing. As I approached, I heard words like international arms trafficking and money laundering. Seriously? My wife? All I could think was, Karen, I hardly knew ye. After the boss Phoebe had finished blustering for the press, I approached the happy group and said with as much indignation as I could muster, "What's going on here? Why is my wife being arrested?" They all whipped around. The oldest of the group, who was clearly the leader, looked at me astonished, pointed and said, "Seize that man." And here I thought that phrase had gone out of vogue in the 1950s. They transported me to the Hoover building in the back of a Crown Vic. I didn't even raid a Phoebe-mobile. I kept asking the two agents in the front seat what was going on, but apparently, their voice boxes had been removed when they were shipped up from Quantico. My mute Phoebe companions parked me in a gray-walled room with the classic one-way mirror. I thought to myself, really? I was too confused to be frightened. You know how it is. Your whole thinking is in one direction and then you're yanked in another. I was just getting my mind around where I was. My interrogation was perfunctory. The interrogator was a she-Phoebe. Her partner was a slick dude right out of Central Casting 4, The Silence of the Lambs. She started in without preliminaries. "If you tell me everything and leave nothing out, you can walk out of here a free man. But if you lie or hold anything back, you are going to spend a lot of time in ADX Florence." I fell back flabbergasted, mouth working like a recently boated tuna. I finally gathered my wits, hunched forward and said, "I know a lot of things, but I don't have the slightest idea what you expect me to tell you. So why don't we start by explaining why I'm here?" The she-Phoebe got a look of disdain on her face and said, "We have your wife on arms trafficking and money laundering, related to her efforts to bring down the Maduro government in Venezuela. You mean to tell me that you don't know anything about that?" I went back to imitating a tuna fish. Karen Ritter, my wife, the innocent freshman girl I'd met almost 20 years ago, was one white Persian cat short of being a James Bond villain? Incredible. Where was I when all of that was going on? The two of them sat there staring silently at me. I must have looked as confused as I felt because the she-Phoebe said angrily, "Dr. Ritter, we need an answer." This was getting too absurd. I didn't even try to organize my thoughts. I just started talking. I said, "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Karen is my wife. She's no international woman of mystery. There is no way on God's green earth that she would even contemplate, let alone do, what you are talking about. She simply doesn't have the worldview or reach." The she-Phoebe said, "She was in Egypt to broker an arms deal between the Saudis and the Sudanese. That deal was going to bring a lot of money to Juan Guaido's resistance forces in Venezuela. We know that because we have been monitoring her since we were tipped off by one of our assets in the Sudan." I said, getting irate, "Let me get this straight. My wife, who is a humble congressional staffer, was working a deal with the Saudis to move arms to Sudan. First of all, why is that a crime? And second of all, how in the world could she pull something like that off? The two Phoebes exchanged significant glances. The slick said, like he was explaining something to a moron, it violates ITR, which falls under the Arms Export Control Act of 1976. It's the law that Ali North broke back in the 80s. Sudan is on the blacklist, along with places like North Korea. He added smugly, your wife was able to pull it off because the UAE wants the F-35 and her boss can make that happen. So, your wife worked out a deal with the Saudis to double their order of Lightning IIs at a very advantageous price. In return, they were going to donate a whole lot of US military hardware to the Sudanese. I said, really angry now. I don't see how that violates anything. What the Saudis do in their own sphere of influence doesn't affect us or our laws. The she-Phoebe laughed and said, they do if the US is subsidizing the sale of the jets and a huge amount of cash is transferred from Khartoum to offshore accounts linked to efforts to overthrow the current Venezuelan government. That violates 18 U.S. Code 2339C, which prohibits the financing of terrorism. Terrorism? OMG, this was just getting worse and worse. My wife, the hot little number I was married to, was leveraging the power of the U.S. arms industry to finance a revolution in South America with illicit funds funneled from a rogue regime in Africa? Unbelievable. I said, totally flabbergasted. And how do you know all of this? The slick said, our friends at Fort Meade listened to every word she said while she was setting it up. I didn't need to ask how they did that. I'm in that business. There's no such thing as a private conversation either cell or conventional if the NSA geeks have a FISA warrant. Encrypted if you like. That's just red meat for them. I said, getting angrier by the second. So why haven't you arrested her boss? McGee was the real source of the corruption. Everybody in the room knew that. Karen was just the fall guy, or fall person, as the politically correct case may be. The she-Phoebe said ominously, because every conversation we have was between your wife and the various players. We have nothing specifically tying McGee to any of this. I sat there dumbstruck. That slippery son of a bitch had set Karen up to be the scapegoat if any part of this deal went south. I knew that McGee'd been getting cozy with Big Oil. Karen and I had had a huge fight about that. And those guys wanted Maduro gone so they could plunder Venezuela's oil reserves. I wondered how much McGee was paid to arrange that hit. I was totally sandbagged. I looked at the two Phoebes, incredulity seeping from every pore. I said, 3 hours ago I was contemplating divorce. Now you're telling me that my wife wasn't cheating. She was the bagman for regime change in Venezuela. I muttered ruefully, I don't know whether to be glad that she was just committing treason, or sad that she might be going away for a while. Will you prosecute her? The she-Phoebe got a look that blended amusement with malice and said, oh, we're going to prosecute her all right. She'll be lucky if she gets out of federal custody before she hits menopause. I'm a naive nerd, but even I knew that was just a gambit, meant to squeeze Karen for all she was worth. They would plead it down to something that involved a few years. In return, Karen would give up everything that she knew about the sordid little deal. That's the way these investigations work. I sighed and said bitterly, I assume you know that I am totally innocent. So, I want to leave. I need to set up bail for my wife. When can I see her? The she-Phoebe got a disapproving look as she said, you can't see her until she's arraigned. Naturally, Karen's arrest was blood on the water for the press. So, all the major news outlets were camped in our front yard, and my wife was a hot mess. Much of Karen's distress was due to the brutal way that McGee jettisoned her. He was outraged. Outraged, I tell you, by the unauthorized actions of one rogue member of his staff. Of course, McGee claimed to have no knowledge of my wife's reprehensible actions, since he barely knew her. But he did tell the press that he would have advised against her unpatriotic deeds if he had even a hint of the evil creature's nefarious plans. After I bailed her, Karen went to bed for 2 days. I finally took some soup in. She was huddled crying in the dark. I took the poor broken thing into my arms and rocked her. I said, we've gotten through everything together, my love, and we're going to get through this. She sniffled and said pitifully, you believe me, don't you? I was just trying to do something good for this country. She whimpered, I was helping out the poor oppressed people of Venezuela and at the same time preventing a nuclear war. Maduro's working with the Russians to create a new Cuban Missile Crisis. We had to stop him. That's what McGee told me. I thought, of course he did. And he was riding on his magic flying unicorn when he sprinkled that pixie dust on you. It was classic Aristotelian hubris. The glaring sun of McGee's influence had blinded my ordinarily sensible wife. But that was all water over the dam now. My only goal was to get Karen to stop beating herself up. I said, "I believe you, my love. You were set up by an amoral guy who used your altruistic instincts, naive idealism, and raw ambition for his own corrupt purposes." Then I added meaningfully, "People fly too close to the sun all the time around here, and most of them end up like Icarus." I said, trying to be practical, "Cooperate with the feds, and I'm sure they'll go easy on you. And I'll be with you every step of the way. I just wish there was something that I could do to put that lying, cheating scumbag in the frame with you." Then it hit me. I said, "Did you discuss any of this with McGee while you were on your trip?" Karen looked at me like I was an idiot. Some of her spunk was coming back. She said, "Of course. Parker Westbrook was coordinating directly with McGee the whole time." "Why do you ask?" "Westbrook was McGee's personal attorney. He would have been the guy I saw her with." I said, "When and how did you discuss it?" Karen said, still mystified, "We talked strategy after dinner every evening. Parker had a secure VPN connection on his laptop. We'd conference with McGee to report progress, and then he'd brief us on what he wanted us to do next." I thought, aha, I'll bet the FISA warrant was only for phone traffic, not voice over IP. They just had the intercepts from Karen's cell, not McGee's laptop. More importantly, I had recorded every word that Karen and McGee had said and stored it in a huge file in the cloud. I hadn't bothered to listen to the recordings after Karen's arrest. They weren't germane anymore. Now, I was going to go through every minute with a fine-tooth comb. I said, grinning like the Cheshire Cat, "Go back to sleep, my love. I think I have something that will help us." I spent all night listening to 7 days of Karen's conversations. Because I'm a petty-minded and insecure little nerd, I was particularly gratified by the number of times that my wife told some chancer that she was a married woman and she loved her husband. But that's another conversation. Along with being a slimy piece of shit, McGee was also a control freak. He clearly didn't trust Karen to be anything but his pawn. So, she and Westbrook would meet in his room every evening. And no, that wasn't a ploy for Westbrook to seduce her. He'd been out and proud for over a decade. The call was through a simple VPN tunnel. The feds wouldn't even be aware that it was being made, let alone listen in. Maybe that was genius on McGee's part, but I heartily doubted it. The dude just didn't want to pay the conventional overseas calling rate. Whatever the motivation, Karen and Westbrook would sit and listen to McGee lay out the next day's marching orders. My rat recorded everything loud and clear. It was ironic, really. I'd set a trap to catch a cheating bitch, and instead I'd caught an unscrupulous douchebag. Still, short of old Lawton standing over his victim with the smoking gun in his hand yelling, "I did it." My evidence was as close as you can get to the term, dead to rights. So, the very next day I fought my way through the cloud of pests encamped on my front lawn and took the metro down to Federal Triangle. From there, I walked over to the Hoover building and asked to talk to whoever was in charge of my wife's case. There was some hemming and hawing and a few, "Who the hell are yous?" But my little recording quickly got me an audience with an associate director and a bunch of his minions. It was like throwing a skunk into the ladies' bridge club. The good news was that the Phoebes now had incontrovertible proof of a major Washington power player committing high crimes and misdemeanors. The bad news was that it was like going fishing for trout and landing a great white shark. You don't just haul a guy like McGee down to the Huskow and toss him into a holding cell. So, as Roy Schneider put it, the Phoebes were gonna need a bigger boat. They told me to sit tight and they'd get back to me. I told them to take all the time they needed, since it would give me the opportunity to saunter around the corner to the post and see what their people made out of my recordings. It was time to play hardball. The head Phoebe didn't miss what I was angling for. "So," he said, "why don't you give me the evidence and forget you ever had it? In return, we let your wife plead to some minor regulatory violation. It'll cost her a couple of months inside, but that way she'll be able to keep her law license." Then he added with grim resolution in his voice, "Otherwise, she's looking at 20 years, and we will prosecute her to the fullest extent." I pondered it for a second. It was a pretty good deal. So, I said, done. 3 weeks later, Karen pled guilty to a couple of minor banking infractions and was sentenced to a 6-month all-expenses-paid trip to Camp Cupcake. Her record would be expunged once she finished her sentence. More delightfully, shortly thereafter McGee resigned from his seat. He told the press that he wanted to spend more time with his family. He also paid a federal fine of almost $10 million for unspecified campaign violations, red blood money. McGee got off lightly in the end. That was because he gave up all of the people involved in his little scheme. That didn't make him popular with his co-conspirators, most of whom resided within U.S. jurisdiction. The culprits were mainly a pack of high-level staffers at DoD and in the defense supplier community and a few C-levels with the oil companies. They all had sticky fingers around the jam jar and a "who me" grin on their face. A series of grand jury indictments followed. Most of them did 3 to 5 at federal expense. And of course, since McGee more or less changed his last name to Stool Pigeon, he was persona non grata everywhere. I hated the fact that the worst that happened to the slimy a-hole was that he would spend the rest of his life sitting in his palatial manor in the great North Woods contemplating the error of his ways. But still, total disgrace was deliciously fitting punishment for an egomaniac like him. Alderson, West Virginia is the home of FPC Alderson. It is a really scenic part of that state. It was raining hard as I drove through the gate and down the drive to the main administrative building. My wife was waiting there. She had her little suitcase with her, and she was wearing a simple blouse and skirt without makeup. She looked gorgeous. I had the tickets to St. Lucia in my suit coat pocket. We walked out the door to the car. I opened it, and she slid in. She hadn't said a word. I started the car, drove over to a less public part of the lot, and parked. We needed to talk. I could see that Karen was deeply depressed. Up until recently, her career had been a continuous march to success. Now she would have to begin again from its ashes. It's just natural for a high achiever like her to feel like her life was over. So, I wanted to tell her that we were going to the sunshine and that we would stay there until we came up with a new plan. Of course, as I'd proven over and over, I'd completely misread my wife. It wasn't her career that she was mourning. It was her marriage. She turned sideways and threw herself onto my chest, weeping piteously. She said, "How can you ever love me again?" That was perhaps history's most ridiculous statement. I kissed her tenderly and said, "Love doesn't have conditions or an expiration date." I fell in love with my study buddy 20 years ago, and that love has only deepened and grown over the succeeding years. We've been together through thick and thin, and that will never change. I grabbed her little finger in a pinky swear and added, "Just like always, back to back." Horns pointed out, "Now we have a date to get naked, live on the beach, and not even think about anything more important than where we're going to have dinner. Then we can talk about the kids." There are 2 important things about 50th wedding anniversaries. The first is the fact that you've been married that long. But perhaps the more important thing is that you're still alive to enjoy it. Karen and I had just celebrated ours. I couldn't complain. At the end of a man's life, it's critically important to believe that you've justified your existence. I'd done some important research and created a whole new field of academic study. I suppose that's about all a fellow like me could ever ask for. The best part was that professor types are never put to pasture. They just drop in the harness. So, at age 72, I was at the peak of my career. I was a very satisfied old man. Karen was as accomplished at motherhood as she was at the sex that had created our 2 kids. Both of them were like shiny new pennies. They were different from each other, but they were equally successful in their respective field. Karen's only goal when they were growing up was to make certain that each was true to their destiny. People are born with innate strengths. Karen insisted that our children recognize what those gifts were and honor them. My wife also had a notable legal career. She never went back into politics. She could have, but she simply had no interest in selling her soul again. Instead, she became a national activist for criminal justice reform. And she wasn't shy about publicizing the reasons why she had such intimate knowledge of the U.S. penal system. She was a powerful advocate for righteous causes. But unlike most crusaders, she knew a lot of important people. And even more relevantly, she knew how things worked on the Hill. So, Karen was the angel of mercy for people who had run out of options. And over a 30-year career, my splendid wife changed the world, all from a storefront in Adams Morgan. In the end, her crusade to empower the powerless brought her the honors that she deserved. That was why my daughter Brooke and I were sitting together in the East Room of the White House, waiting for the Presidential Medal of Freedom Award ceremony. Brooke was an exact replica of her mom, a tiny, power-packed bundle of stunning beauty, penetrating intelligence, and savage wit. With her Harvard law degree and her unconquerable soul, Brooke should be making serious money in corporate America. Instead, she was an even more terrifying version of her mother in defense of the wrongly accused. Her brother Paul was 2 years older. Physically and intellectually, he's my spitting image, but he burns with Karen's fierce desire to do great things. So, he joined the Air Force after getting his master's in aerospace engineering from Michigan. Now, he is one of a select few who fly the B-2 Spirit. He hated to miss the ceremony, but the best of the best must ever keep vigilant watch on the walls. The Marine band started in with ruffles and flourishes and segued into Hail to the Chief as the president walked into the room. The little group of honorees rose together on the dais. The 70-year-old woman in the middle was smaller than the rest, but she radiated the serene beauty and forceful spirit that told the world how special she was. Karen stared unwaveringly into my eyes as the president hung the medal around her neck. In that moment, it was just the two of us together in that room. I knew what she was telling me. I thought back to her shining, eager face, asking for a simple set of directions, and remembered it all. I thought to myself, well done, old girl. We built quite a life together. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.